I'd like to start in the period between 1968 and 1970 because, and this came as a shock to me when I was researching for this conversation, but for all of Australia's storied efforts in service of the cause of the elimination of nuclear weapons from the world, we refused to sign the NPT for 2 years under the Gorton government, under John Gorton's government. He sat on the signature of the treaty from 1968 to 1970. And in fact, Australia was the second last country to sign the treaty before it came into force in 1970. And the reason Australia didn't want to sign the treaty was primarily to keep the option open of developing its own nuclear arsenal. So I want to start here both because it's historically interesting, but also because I think it's a useful allegory for non-proliferation more broadly. Now, at the time, you were in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and before that, as your first job out of university, you worked at the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. Tell me what you remember of the debate about nuclear weapons within the Australian government in the late 60s, and how plausible was it that Australia might actually have gone ahead with building nuclear weapons of its own?
What an interesting question. It was a very, very difficult time, and I think in the end, Australia made the right choice. But as you point out, the choice to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty came late, and that caught very negative attention in the world of states interested in controlling the spread of nuclear weapons. We weren't supposed to be that kind of country. So your question, is right on point. How was that possible? Was it John Gorton or what was going on? And I think there's a very simple answer, which is that the Australian Atomic Energy Commission was substantially in the control of a person called Philip Baxter. In fact, in the old days, old titles were still in currency. He was Sir Philip Baxter. He had worked as a young scientist in the Manhattan Project that developed the nuclear weapon in the United States. There were 4 or 5 Australian scientists on that project. Another famous one was Sir Ernest Titterton. But Baxter wasn't actually an Australian. He was from the United Kingdom. I'm not even sure that he was Welsh, but he was from the United Kingdom, and he came to Australia and found his way into important jobs and became chairman of the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. And he got the ear of John Gorton, and it was all around Jervis Bay. The idea was that we would build a reactor in Jervis Bay where we would make weapons-grade fissionable material and then, of course, make nuclear weapons. Baxter's outlook was that we white folk, sorry if that sounds rough, but he was that kind of fellow. We white folk have a right to develop the weapons that we need to keep the hordes away from harming us. And he actually, you could say that there are some echoes of that today, but anyway, that's how it was then. And he got Gorton's attention, and there was a very severe argument in Canberra, in the bureaucracy, in the department that I then worked for, in the Atomic Energy Commission, of course, in the defence community, about whether or not we should move towards getting nuclear weapons. And the argument in the end came down to joining where the whole world was going, which was to establish this truly important treaty that was designed to put an end to the development of nuclear weapons and, of course, stop their proliferation. As Kennedy, as you point out, President Kennedy had predicted that we faced a pretty disastrous world unless we did a treaty such as this one. And in the end, we joined it, but we entered reservations. We're one of the only states in joining it expressed, I can't even remember the weasel words that were used to express this reservation, in extremis, we might want to withdraw. The treaty has in it a withdrawal clause for any member of the treaty if they felt their supreme national interests justified that. But we came in, but we had to sort of, make this little reservation to, I guess, for a sop for the right wing of the Liberal Party, a sop for Philip Baxter, I'm not sure.
Right. I think you wrote an article for the Bulletin in maybe the late 60s where you compared Philip Baxter to Dr. Strangelove.
Yes. And I don't know how I escaped punishment for that. I have no idea how I got away with that. But I remember being deeply upset the day I heard in the department in Canberra that Gorton's decision initially was that we would not sign that treaty. I couldn't believe it. And yes, I hit the typewriter, as it probably was then a typewriter in those days, but that's how old I am. But I submitted a piece to the Bulletin, and God bless them, they published it. And I thought, well, I can kiss my career goodbye. But I thought it was so important to stand up and be counted on this and point out where the influence was coming from, namely Baxter. And as I say, I don't know to this day how I got away with it.
When I was preparing for this conversation, someone drew to my attention these cables that Dean Rusk, the then US Secretary of State, sent back to Washington after he met with Gorton in 1968. And they're pretty extraordinary. I've got the main one here, but Rusk says, Gorton is deeply concerned about giving up the nuclear option for a period as long as 25 years when he cannot know how the situation will develop in the area. He sounded almost like de Gaulle in saying that Australia could not rely upon the United States for nuclear weapons under ANZUS in the event of nuclear blackmail or attack on Australia. And then he goes on, I will not recount what I said to him, but I opened up all stops.
How interesting. Yeah.
These were declassified by the National Security Archive.
How very interesting.
Yeah.
I must say, I can see that declassified, yeah. I must say that's perhaps the only issue on which I might have found myself in agreement with John Gorton. I don't think we could then or can now rely upon, and why should we? We'll get into this, I'm sure, in this wonderful conversation, but why should we rely upon a nuclear weapons state to protect us? And why do we think that they would do that when a decision to protect us with the threat of use of nuclear weapons simply attracts retaliation to them? I mean, interesting declassified cable you've got there.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the possibility of nuclear breakouts and horizontal proliferation in the final part of our conversation. But yeah, that Australian anecdote was just fascinating because it shows how, before the NPT, it shows how real the possibility of nuclear breakouts were if even Australia was considering obtaining the bomb. But
I think you've made a good point, and I want to emphasise the possibility that we would have accepted Baxter's advice and started a nuclear weapons program I want to emphasise this, was by no means small. It was line ball that we got to the decision that we did. The influence of Baxter and other sources in the Australian bureaucracy towards us becoming a nuclear weapons state was very, very strong.
Right.